For most of recorded history, the account of the Sioux appeared complete. They were the people of the Great Plains, skilled warriors, hunters of the buffalo, the nation that dealt the United States Army its most devastating defeat at the Little Bighorn. They were, in the popular imagination and in most textbooks, the defining symbol of Native American resistance. The story seemed finished, authoritative, settled into the permanence of things no longer in question. But history, even the kind printed in classrooms and repeated across generations, is always only the most recently visible layer of a far older and far more complicated record. And sometimes, when the deeper layers are finally exposed, they describe a world that the surface version had not prepared anyone to encounter. In 2021, a research team at the University of Cambridge, led by geneticist Eske Willerslev, completed an analysis of autosomal DNA extracted from a lock of hair that had belonged to Sitting Bull, the most consequential and most recognizable figure in the entire history of the Sioux people. The study produced a confirmation that was historically significant, emotionally powerful, and profoundly human in its implications. Sitting Bull's biological descendants are alive today. His great-grandson, a man named Ernie LaPointe, carries in his own cells a measurable and statistically verifiable genetic continuity with his famous ancestor across more than a century of separation. That confirmation matters on its own terms. It connects living people to their history in a way that no document or oral record can replicate. But running beneath that confirmation, embedded in that same line of research and in dozens of related genomic studies conducted across the preceding decade, was something else entirely. Something that the researchers had not anticipated. Something that, even now, no one has been able to fully account for. The Sioux carry a mitochondrial haplogroup that, according to every established framework for understanding the genetic history of the Americas, has no straightforward explanation for being there. To understand why that matters, you need a brief foundation in how population genetics actually works, specifically how scientists use mitochondrial DNA to reach backward across thousands of years of human movement. Mitochondrial DNA is genetic material that passes exclusively through the maternal line. It travels from mother to child, generation after generation, without the mixing and recombination that affects the rest of the genome. This makes it an extraordinarily precise instrument for tracing ancestry. When a mutation occurs in a mitochondrial sequence, it marks everyone descended from that maternal line from that point forward. Geneticists use these accumulated mutations to group people into haplogroups, categories that function, in effect, as surnames written not in language but in cellular chemistry, transmitted unchanged through maternal descent across hundreds of generations. When you identify someone's mitochondrial haplogroup, you are reading something more than their biology. You are reading ancient geography. You are following the migration routes their maternal ancestors walked 10,000 years ago or more. Indigenous people of the Americas, as a population, carry 5 primary mitochondrial haplogroups designated A, B, C, D, and X. The first 4, A through D, have clear, traceable origins. Their ancestral forms exist in Siberia, in the populations geographically closest to the Beringian land bridge that connected Asia to North America during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were low enough. That alone is a statistically significant presence, not a faint trace, not a marginal signal that might be dismissed as noise, but a meaningful and recurring feature of the Sioux genetic profile. But the thing that transforms haplogroup X from a notable statistic into a genuine scientific puzzle is where the haplogroup is not found. It is not in Siberia. It is not in the populations bordering the Beringian corridor. It is not present among the northeastern Asian peoples most closely related to the ancestral founding population of the Americas. Every other haplogroup carried by Native American populations has a traceable ancestral presence in the Asian source populations, a clear line of genetic continuity connecting the New World populations back to the Old World origin. Haplogroup X has no such line. Instead, haplogroup X in its related global forms is found concentrated in the Middle East, in the Caucasus region, and in parts of southern Europe. The closest genetic relatives of the specific variant found among the Sioux, designated X2A, exist not across the Bering Strait, but across the Atlantic. not in the populations from which Native Americans are known to have descended, but in populations on the opposite side of Eurasia. Scientists have named this the X problem. It has remained unresolved across decades of research, surviving every attempt at a clean explanation. When a finding of this kind surfaces in the genetic literature, three broad interpretive frameworks typically emerge from the research community. Each of them, on close examination, turns out to be capable of explaining part of the problem without fully resolving it. The first interpretation is the most structurally dramatic: a pre-Columbian transatlantic migration. Under this hypothesis, some ancient population from Europe or the Near East, potentially related to or descended from the Solutrean culture of Ice Age southwestern Europe, crossed the Atlantic Ocean along the southern margins of the glacial ice sheets, following coastlines and ice edges in the same manner that Arctic peoples have always traveled by sea, and eventually contributed to the gene pool of populations that would later become the Sioux or their ancestors. This hypothesis was taken seriously by a portion of the academic community through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. The archaeological parallels cited in its support were not trivial. The stone tool technology associated with the Solutrean culture of Ice Age France and Spain and the early Clovis technology of North America share specific technical features, particular flaking patterns, specific blade geometries, that are difficult to explain as independent invention without at minimum acknowledging the resemblance as a problem requiring explanation. But the hypothesis encountered a significant evidentiary obstacle. Kennewick Man, one of the oldest and most completely preserved human skeletal remains ever recovered in North America, found along the Columbia River in Washington state and directly dated to more than 8,000 years ago, underwent complete genome sequencing in 2015. His skull morphology had led some researchers to propose European or Polynesian ancestry. His genome rejected both proposals without ambiguity. He was, the DNA showed clearly and without meaningful statistical uncertainty, a Native American. His closest modern genetic relatives were indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The transatlantic migration hypothesis, at least as a primary mechanism for explaining haplogroup X, did not survive that test intact. The second interpretive framework locates the answer in Beringia itself, rather than across the Atlantic. The argument runs as follows. The ancestral population that moved from Asia into the Americas was not a single ethnically or genetically uniform group. It was a diverse founding population that spent an extended period, perhaps several thousand years, geographically contained within the land mass of Beringia, before the rising seas of the post-glacial period submerged that corridor beneath what is now the Bering Sea. During that period of geographic isolation, some researchers propose haplogroup X2A evolved within the Beringian population from an ancestral form that had previously existed across a wider Siberian range, then went extinct on the Asian side of the corridor while surviving and propagating in the populations that moved south into the Americas. The absence of haplogroup X in modern Siberian populations under this interpretation does not indicate that the haplogroup originated elsewhere. It indicates that the lineages carrying it on the Asian side simply died out, a process that is common in population history and leaves no recoverable trace if no ancient DNA from those extinct lineages has been preserved and recovered. This explanation is internally coherent. The problem is that it cannot be confirmed with the evidence currently available. Proving the absence of a haplogroup in ancient Siberian populations would require a volume and geographic distribution of ancient DNA sampling from that region that has not yet been achieved. The third interpretation approaches the question from a direction that is perhaps the most conceptually disorienting of the three: a back migration from the Americas into Asia. Research published in the journal Current Biology examined the genomes of 3 individuals who died on a riverbank in Kamchatka, in the far northeastern corner of Siberia, approximately 500 years ago. Their genetic profiles contained clear signals of North American indigenous ancestry. Something had moved in the opposite direction. Some Native American population, or descendants of such a population, had crossed back into Siberia at some point, mixed with local Siberian communities, and left a recoverable genetic record. The conclusion this forces is significant. The Bering Corridor was not a one-way passage. For as long as the geography permitted, it was a route used in both directions. People crossed from Asia into the Americas. People crossed back. The genetic exchange was bidirectional, sustained over millennia, and ceased only when the rising post-glacial sea levels made regular crossing impossible. As one researcher described it in the paper's discussion section, the corridor functioned less like a gate through which a founding population passed once, and more like a bridge used continuously in both directions until the water rose and the bridge disappeared. None of these three frameworks fully closes the question. Each accounts for a portion of what the data shows. None accounts for all of it. That is where the science currently stands, and this is precisely the point at which the investigation becomes most genuinely interesting. In 2014, researchers analyzing the genome of a 24,000-year-old individual recovered from a burial site called Malta in southern Siberia, referred to in the scientific literature as MA1, produced findings that fundamentally reorganized the entire framework within which these questions were being asked. Between 14 and 38% of this ancient Siberian individual's ancestry traced back to a population that also contributed genetically to the ancestors of modern West Eurasians. An individual buried in Siberia 24,000 years ago had partial genetic affinity with populations on the western end of the Eurasian continent. And the same ancient ancestry component, the same genetic signal associated with this ancient Siberian population, appears, when searched for, in the genomes of indigenous people across the Americas. Not just the Sioux. Virtually all tested Native American populations carry some proportion of this ancestry. The implication is substantial. The West Eurasian-associated genetic component present in Native American DNA was not introduced recently. It was not the result of post-Columbian contact. It was not brought to the Americas by European colonization. It was carried into the Western Hemisphere by the founding population itself, by the people who crossed Beringia between 15 and 20,000 years ago, who were themselves already the product of ancient admixture between East Asian and ancient West Eurasian-related populations that had occurred tens of thousands of years earlier on the far side of the world, long before any human being stood on American soil. The haplogroup X signal in the Sioux does not represent an anomaly specific to the Sioux. It represents a thread of the universal human origin story, one of many threads that the founding populations of the Americas carried with them from a world far older and far more genetically interconnected than any of the simple migration narratives had accounted for. The mystery is not a mystery about the Sioux in particular. It is a mystery about the entire human journey. And now the story shifts in a different direction, because the Sioux were not originally from the Great Plains at all. Not their ancestors, not the people from whom they descended. The grassland warrior identity, the buffalo hunting culture, the equestrian society that defined the Sioux in the imagination of every subsequent generation, all of that came later, much later. The Sioux oral traditions have always contained this information. Early European ethnographers who recorded accounts from Sioux and Lakota elders during the 18th and 19th centuries documented a consistent narrative. The ancestors had come from the east, from a great river, from a country of forests and earthworks, far removed from the open plains that the Sioux called home by the time those accounts were recorded. Modern linguistic and archaeological work confirms the oral tradition with precision. The Proto-Siouan language, the common ancestral form from which all branches of the Sioux language family descended, including Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Osage, and related tongues, points through comparative linguistic analysis to an origin homeland in the Ohio River Valley and the upper Mississippi region. The best current estimates place the divergence of Proto-Siouan into its various descendant languages at approximately 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, in the forested interior of the North American continent, far to the east of the Great Plains. Archaeological evidence supports this timeline. Sites in what is now Minnesota, including the areas around Granite Falls and Browns Valley, document the presence of Dakota-related people in the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest region during the late Woodland period, roughly 500 to 1,000 years before the Common Era. During that extended period, the ancestors of the Sioux were not nomadic hunters following bison across open grassland. They were semi-sedentary woodland communities, cultivating maize and other crops, hunting and fishing along forested river systems, building the kinds of settled and semi-settled communities that woodland environments support. The mounted feathered warrior sweeping across the open plains, that image is historically real. But it is the last chapter of a story that was unfolding for thousands of years before it reached that particular form. The transformation happened through displacement. In the early decades of the 18th century, the Ojibwe people, who had obtained firearms through trade relationships with French and British colonial networks, began an expansion westward that systematically pushed Sioux communities out of their Minnesota and Wisconsin homelands and onto the open grasslands to the west. The Sioux did not choose the Great Plains, they were driven to them. And there, within a compressed span of time, remarkable even by the standards of rapid cultural adaptation, they encountered the horse. The horse had been absent from the Americas since the end of the last ice age, when the prehistoric horses that had evolved in North America went extinct along with the other megafauna of that period. Spanish colonization reintroduced domesticated horses into the continent beginning in the 16th century. By the early 18th century, horse populations had spread northward from Spanish territories through trade and capture, and were reaching the communities being pushed westward from the woodlands. The Sioux acquired horses and within a few generations built around them one of the most complete and sophisticated equestrian cultures in human history. New hunting strategies, new military tactics, new forms of social organization, new ceremonial practices, new artistic traditions, all of it emerging in the space of a century or two from a people who had never sat on a horse before. The warriors who faced the 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn in 1876 had been a horse culture for approximately 100 years. Consider the full depth of the timeline that fact opens up. The people present at Little Bighorn carried mitochondrial haplogroups whose origins trace back to a Siberian founding population that was itself already the product of ancient Eurasian admixture occurring tens of thousands of years earlier. Their linguistic ancestors had been woodland farmers in the Ohio Valley 2,000 years before. Their great-grandparents had been forest people in Minnesota. Their grandparents had been displaced onto unfamiliar grasslands. And their parents had been among the first generations to fully inhabit the equestrian identity that would define the Sioux in every historical account written after. Every single one of those layers is real. Every one of them is part of the same continuous human story. When Professor Willerslev and his team at Cambridge confirmed that Ernie LaPointe carried verifiable genetic continuity with Sitting Bull, they were not merely answering a genealogical question. They were demonstrating something about the fundamental nature of human identity, about how identity persists, how it moves through bodies and through time, how it endures across distances and through disruptions that were specifically designed to sever it. The Sioux experienced deliberate and systematic attempts to destroy the threads of cultural and biological continuity. Forced relocations severed communities from their lands. Children were removed from their families and placed in institutions designed to eliminate their languages and their ways of understanding the world. Entire generations were subjected to policies whose explicit purpose was cultural erasure. The genetics survived all of that. It survived in the cells of people who were told that who they had been before did not matter and did not exist anymore. It carried forward in bodies across every attempt to break the chain, and it waits now to be read by anyone with the tools and the will to read it honestly. Here is what the complete picture reveals, and why what it reveals extends far beyond a single nation or a single strand of research. The Sioux are not an exception. They are a particularly well-documented instance of a principle that applies to every human population that has ever existed on this planet. No human ancestry is simple. No lineage is pure in the way that the concept of purity implies. No people arrived where they are from a single point of origin without accumulating along the way the genetic traces of every population they encountered, absorbed, were absorbed by, displaced, or were displaced by. The clean origin stories, the bounded ethnic identities, the pure ancestral homelands, the straight unbroken lines of descent are constructions. They are narratives placed over a biological reality that was always more fluid, more interconnected, more layered than those narratives had room to represent. The haplogroup X signal in the Sioux connects to an ancient Siberian population that was itself carrying the remnant traces of a West Eurasian ancestry already ancient before the Americas were inhabited. The Sioux language connects to woodland communities in the Ohio River Valley 2 millennia ago. The buffalo hunting equestrian culture connects to a displacement that occurred within historical memory and a transformation that happened within a few human generations. And the DNA of Sitting Bull connects through a direct maternal and paternal chain to a living man who stood in a European laboratory and received biological confirmation of what his family had carried in their memory without needing a laboratory to tell them. Every one of those layers is simultaneously true. None of them cancels any other. They accumulate the way that all human history accumulates, into something that resists reduction, that cannot be made to fit a single origin point or a single defining identity without losing the most essential thing about it. The Sioux were never simply what the textbooks described, and the thing that makes that statement worth sitting with is its universality. Neither, it turns out, is any other people. Neither, if you examine the evidence honestly, are you. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the Oglala Lakota Nation, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and the other nations that compose the broader Sioux Confederacy continue to maintain living cultures rooted in the full depth of this layered history. The Lakota language, one of the most structurally complex languages in the world by the measure of its verb system alone, remains a living tongue, the subject of serious revitalization efforts led by community members who understand that language is not merely a communication system. It is a way of organizing experience that cannot be fully translated into any other form. The ceremonies, the land relationships, the philosophical frameworks, the artistic traditions, the beadwork, the quill work, the storytelling, the relationship to the Black Hills, and the broader landscape of the northern plains. All of it continues, carrying forward threads that run back through woodland forests and ancient Siberian steppes and genetic admixtures so old that they predate any civilization capable of recording them. The genomic research will continue, the reference panels will expand. The ancient DNA archive will grow as new sites are excavated and new samples are recovered and new consent agreements are reached between researchers and the communities whose ancestors are being studied. Each new study adds resolution to a picture that will not be complete in any of our lifetimes. But what the existing body of research has already established, firmly enough that it no longer requires qualification, is this. The people we call the Sioux are the living carriers of a human history so old, so geographically vast, so biologically interconnected, and so resistant to any simple summary that the stories written about them in the past were not merely incomplete. They were inadequate to the scale of what they were attempting to describe. The story is deeper than the maps showed. The roots reach further back than any settled account had traced. And the people who carry this history in their cells, their languages, their ceremonies, and their memories are not a fixed point in a story that ended at Little Bighorn or at Wounded Knee. They are a living continuation of a journey that began before recorded history and has not stopped.